Frost coated the inside walls of the cabin where Ingrid Halverson huddled with her two daughters around a small metal box that burned with a flame no one else in Dakota Territory had ever seen. Outside, the blizzard of 1883 raged at 45 degrees below zero, and 3 miles away, her neighbors were already frozen dead. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is even more impossible than this one. The air smelled wrong in November of 1882. Ingrid Halverson noticed it the morning she walked to the creek behind her cabin to fetch water. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and the wind carried a metallic sharpness that made her Scandinavian instincts prickle with unease. She had lived through 7 Dakota Territory winters since immigrating from Norway, but this felt different. The chickens huddled motionless in their coop despite the morning hour. The few remaining geese that hadn't migrated south gathered in nervous clusters near the barn. Even the crow that usually pestered her vegetable garden was silent, watching from the roof beam with an intensity that seemed almost human. Ingrid was 31 years old that autumn, a widow for 8 months. Her husband Lars had died the previous February during a cold snap that lasted 9 days. They had run low on firewood on the 6th day. Lars had gone out in 20 below temperatures to chop more from the woodpile and returned soaking wet after breaking through ice on the creek. Pneumonia took him 4 days later, despite everything Ingrid tried: hot compresses, whiskey, prayers in Norwegian that her daughters didn't understand. She had kept the wood stove burning as hot as she could manage, but the cabin leaked heat through a dozen gaps in the chinking, and the fever consumed him anyway. Her daughters, Emma and Liv, were 8 and 6 years old now. They had their father's blonde hair and their mother's serious gray eyes. Emma helped with the cooking and mending without being asked. Liv still played with cornhusk dolls, but was learning to collect eggs without breaking them. They were good children, obedient and quiet in the way frontier children learn to be. But they were also fragile in ways that terrified Ingrid every time the temperature dropped. She had watched Lars die from cold-related illness. She knew exactly how quickly the wilderness could kill. The trading post 12 miles south confirmed her fears when she made the journey in mid-November. Old Heinrich Dortmann, who had trapped these territories since 1863, stood by the stove whittling and talking to the younger men. "Animals are wrong this year," he said in his thick German accent. "Rabbits growing winter coats in October, squirrels burying twice the normal stores. I seen this once before, back in '67. That winter killed more men than the Sioux raids." The younger trappers laughed nervously, but Heinrich didn't smile. "You folk with families, you stock heavy this year. Wood, food, everything. This winter gonna be a killer." Ingrid bought extra lamp oil that day, more than she needed. She didn't know why yet, just that something in her gut told her to do it. She also bought 20 pounds of lard, a spool of copper wire, and a box of cotton wick material. The clerk looked at her strangely, but took her money. On the ride home, the temperature dropped another 15 degrees. By the time she reached the cabin, frost was forming on the reins in her hands. Ingrid began her experiments in the small shed Lars had built behind the cabin for storing tools and processing game. The shed was drafty and cold, but it was separate from the main cabin, which meant she could test dangerous ideas without risking her daughters. She started with a simple question that had formed during those terrible days watching Lars die. What if there was a way to generate heat that didn't depend on hauling frozen wood through blizzard conditions? She remembered the kerosene lamp on their table, how its small flame could warm hands held close to the glass chimney, how it burned for hours of talols on a few ounces of oil. The efficiency fascinated her. A single cup of lamp oil produced more sustained heat than a cup of wood coals, and it burned cleaner with less smoke. The principle seemed scalable. If a tiny lamp wick could heat a small area, perhaps a larger wick with more fuel could heat enough space to keep children alive. Her first test used a tin cup, a strip of cotton torn from an old shirt, and 2 ounces of lamp oil. She soaked the cotton, draped it over the cup's edge with one end submerged in the oil, and lit it with a match. The flame caught immediately, burning bright yellow with a steady intensity. She held her hands 8 inches above it and felt genuine heat, more concentrated than she expected. The flame burned for 45 minutes before consuming the oil. She recorded this in a notebook Lars had used for trapping records. 2 ounces, 45 minutes, significant heat in 6-inch radius. But lamp oil cost 12 cents per gallon at the trading post. Heating through an entire winter would bankrupt her. She needed alternatives. Over the next 3 weeks, as December cold settled over Dakota territory, Ingrid tested every combustible substance she could acquire. She rendered bear fat from a carcass she had purchased from a Lakota hunter who passed through in late autumn. The fat burned hot, but produced thick, black smoke that made her eyes water and left greasy soot on everything. She tried pure lard from butchering her fall pig. It burned cleaner than bear fat, but still smoky, and it solidified at low temperatures, making it difficult to work with. She experimented with grain alcohol from her medicine stores, mixing it with animal fats in different ratios. Pure alcohol burned too fast and too hot, consuming itself in minutes. But a mixture of 3 parts lard to 1 part alcohol burned slower and hotter than lard alone, and the alcohol seemed to help the lard liquefy at lower temperatures. She tried adding lamp oil to the mixture. 2 parts lard, 1 part lamp oil, 1 part alcohol. The combination burned with a cleaner flame, less smoke, and produced intense heat. The Schneider family visited in mid-December, their wagon loaded with supplies from the trading post. Friedrich Schneider saw Ingrid shed experiments through the open door, the tin cups, the burn marks, the crocks of rendered fat. "Playing with fire like a child," he said to his wife Katrina in German, loud enough for Ingrid to hear. "Lars dies and she wastes money on lamp oil and grease. Next winter she'll be begging for charity." Katrina shushed him, but Ingrid saw the pity in her eyes. They thought she was losing her mind to grief. Ingrid let them think it. She returned to her experiments with renewed focus. By Christmas, she had tested 43 different fuel combinations and recorded the results of each one meticulously. The ammunition box had been sitting in the corner of the shed for 5 years, a relic from Lars's brief service in the Army before they married. It was heavy-gauge steel, approximately 12 inches square and 10 inches deep, with a hinged lid and a simple clasp. The metal was thick enough to withstand rough handling, which meant it was thick enough to contain sustained heat without warping. Ingrid cleaned out the old cartridge residue and gun oil, scrubbing the interior with sand and lye soap, until the metal showed clean and gray. She started by removing the hinges and lid entirely. The box needed to radiate heat upward, not trap it inside. Using a cold chisel and hammer, she spent 2 days cutting ventilation holes in a specific pattern along the bottom and lower sides. The holes needed to be large enough to allow oxygen flow for combustion, but small enough to prevent fuel spillage. She measured each hole carefully, spacing them 2 inches apart in rows that circled the base. The work was brutal on her hands. The chisel slipped repeatedly, leaving cuts across her knuckles. The December cold made the metal brittle and unpredictable. For the top opening, she needed something that would allow heat to radiate while preventing accidental contact with the flame. She found a metal grate in the trading post's scrap pile, left over from someone's abandoned stove project, and cut it to fit the box's opening. The grate sat an inch below the rim, creating a protective barrier while allowing maximum heat radiation. She secured it with bent nails that she hammered through pre-drilled holes, clinching them on the outside to create permanent fasteners. The fuel delivery system presented the greatest challenge. She needed a way to drip liquid fuel into the firebox at a controlled, steady rate without manual adjustment every few minutes. Gravity feed seemed the obvious solution, but it required precision she wasn't sure she could achieve with frontier tools. She scavenged copper tubing, from an old moonshine still that had belonged to the previous homesteader, a Swedish bachelor who had frozen to death during the winter of 1878. The still had been left in the root cellar, forgotten, until Ingrid went searching for useful metal. She cut a 3-foot section of the copper tubing, approximately a quarter-inch in diameter. One end would connect to a fuel reservoir positioned higher than the firebox. The other end would drip directly onto a wick bed inside the box. But she needed a valve to control flow rate. After 3 failed attempts using carved wooden plugs that either leaked constantly or stuck completely closed, she created a simple wire valve, a stiff piece of wire that could be inserted into the tube to partially block flow, with the wire's position determining drip speed. She drilled a hole in the side of the ammunition box, 2 inches from the bottom, and fitted the copper tube through it. Using a mixture of clay and ash, she sealed around the tube to make it airtight, while still allowing the tube to be adjusted if needed. Inside the box, she created a wick bed using a flat piece of tin with edges bent upward to form a shallow tray. Cotton wick material would sit in this tray, absorbing fuel dripped from the tube above. By early January of 1883, she had a complete prototype. The firebox sat on her workbench looking crude but functional, a scarred metal box with a grate top, ventilation holes, and a copper tube emerging from one side. Ingrid spent the first 2 weeks of January 1883 refining her fuel mixture with the intensity of an alchemist searching for gold. She had narrowed her options to 3 primary ingredients: rendered lard, lamp oil, and grain alcohol. Each had advantages and fatal flaws. Lard was cheap and abundant, but produced smoke and solidified in extreme cold. Lamp oil burned clean, but cost too much for extended use. Grain alcohol burned hot and prevented freezing, but consumed itself too quickly. The solution lay in finding the correct proportions. She set up a testing station in the shed with 5 tin cups, each containing a different ratio. Cup 1, pure lard. Cup 2, half lard, half lamp oil. Cup 3, 2 parts lard, 1 part lamp oil. Cup 4, 3 parts lard, 2 parts lamp oil, 1 part alcohol. Cup 5, equal parts of all 3. She lit each wick simultaneously and observed. Pure lard then produced thick smoke within minutes. The 50-50 mixture burned cleaner, but still created a haze. The 2-to-1 ratio showed improvement, but cup 4, 3 parts lard, 2 parts lamp oil, 1 part alcohol, burned with a steady flame that produced minimal smoke and intense heat. She tested this mixture for 6 consecutive days, recording burn time, heat output, smoke production, and how the fuel behaved at different temperatures. She left a cup of the mixture outside overnight when the temperature dropped to 15 below zero. In the morning, it had thickened slightly but remained pourable. Pure lard would have been solid as tallow. The alcohol prevented complete solidification, while the lamp oil reduced the lard's tendency to smoke. The ratio worked. Now she needed quantity. Rendering animal fat became her obsession. She bought every scrap of pig fat the trading post butcher would sell her, paying 3 cents per pound for trimmings most people threw to dogs. She rendered fat from the deer carcass hanging in her cold shed, carefully separating the tallow and heating it in her largest pot until it liquefied. She even rendered the fat from 6 geese she slaughtered from her small flock, birds she had planned to keep for spring eggs. The rendering process was time-consuming and filled the cabin with a thick, greasy smell that clung to everything. Emma complained that her hair smelled like bacon. Liv refused to eat for a day, insisting everything tasted like lard. But Ingrid continued, heating fat, straining out solids, pouring the clean liquid into every available container. She used crocks, jars, empty lard tins, even cleaned out vinegar bottles. Each container was labeled with the date and contents in her careful handwriting. She bought 4 gallons of lamp oil from the trading post, an expense that consumed most of her winter cash reserve. The clerk, a thin man named Peterson, raised his eyebrows when she requested that much. "Planning to read a lot this winter, Mrs. Halverson?" he asked. Ingrid didn't answer. She also bought 2 quarts of grain alcohol at 50 cents per quart, ostensibly for medicinal purposes. Peterson made a note in his ledger, and Ingrid knew the purchase would fuel gossip. The widow Halverson buying alcohol. People would assume she was drinking away her grief. By January 8th, she had 40 gallons of her fuel mixture stored in the cabin, 30 gallons of rendered lard, mixed with 8 gallons of lamp oil and 2 gallons of grain alcohol. The crocks lined the wall behind the wood stove, a small fortune in rendered fat and purchased fuel. The temperature on January 9, 1883, dropped with a speed that defied natural patterns. At dawn, it was 5 degrees above zero, cold but manageable. By mid-morning, it had fallen to 10 below. By noon, 20 below. Ingrid stood at the cabin window watching the sky turn a peculiar yellow-gray color she had never seen before, like old bruises spreading across the horizon. The chickens refused to leave their coop. The 2 remaining geese huddled against the cabin's south wall, motionless. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind began. It started as a low moan that made the cabin timbers creak, then built into a sustained roar that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming at once. Snow didn't fall from the sky so much as materialize in the air itself, appearing as if conjured by the wind. Within an hour, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Ingrid could barely see the shed 30 yards away. By 4 o'clock, she couldn't see it at all. She brought Emma and Liv inside from their afternoon chores and barred the door with the heavy wooden beam Lars had installed. The wind hammered against the walls with physical force, making the whole structure shudder. She loaded the wood stove with split oak and opened the damper fully, pushing the fire as hot as it would safely burn. The stove glowed red along its sides. Heat radiated in waves, and for the first hour the cabin felt almost too warm. But as darkness fell and the temperature outside continued plummeting, Ingrid began noticing changes. Frost appeared on the interior walls near the corners farthest from the stove, delicate patterns that looked almost decorative in the lamplight. She touched the logs near the door and found them ice cold, despite the roaring fire 15 feet away. Cold air seeped through gaps in the chinking that had seemed adequate all winter. The cabin was losing heat faster than the stove could produce it. By midnight, the temperature outside had reached 40 below zero, though Ingrid wouldn't learn the exact number until days later. Inside, her breath formed clouds even near the stove. She piled every blanket and fur they owned onto the girls' bed and had them sleep together for warmth. She sat in the rocking chair, feeding logs into the stove every 20 minutes, listening to the wind, watching frost patterns spread across the walls like invasive vines. At dawn on January 10th, she opened the door a crack to check conditions and was nearly knocked backward by wind that felt like a physical blow. Snow had drifted against the cabin's north side, climbing halfway up the wall. The woodshed door was completely buried. She slammed the door shut and dropped the bar back in place. They were trapped inside with approximately 3 days of wood stacked near the stove, a compromised heating system, and 2 children who were already shivering despite being wrapped in layers of wool and fur. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping. The chimney began failing on the 2nd day of the blizzard. Ingrid noticed it during the morning fire stoking when smoke that should have drawn cleanly up the flue instead curled back into the cabin in lazy, acrid clouds. She opened the damper wider, but it made little difference. The problem wasn't airflow regulation. The problem was ice forming inside the chimney pipe where warm smoke met metal chilled to 45 degrees below zero. Moisture in the smoke condensed instantly and froze, creating a thickening layer of ice that narrowed the flue's diameter with each passing hour. She had 3 choices, all terrible. She could maintain a hot fire and risk filling the cabin with smoke that would suffocate them. She could reduce the fire to minimize smoke and watch the interior temperature drop to lethal levels, or she could go outside in 60-mile-per-hour winds at 45 below zero and attempt to clear the chimney, which would almost certainly kill her. She chose option 2. Survival meant staying alive long enough for the storm to break. even if that meant enduring dangerous cold. She let the fire burn down to coals and added only small pieces of wood, just enough to maintain minimal heat without producing excessive smoke. The cabin temperature dropped immediately. Within 2 hours, it was below freezing everywhere except within 5 feet of the stove. Frost thickened on the walls. The water bucket near the door developed a skin of ice. Emma's lips took on a pale blue tinge that terrified Ingrid more than anything else in her life. On the afternoon of January 11th, Ingrid made a desperate attempt to reach the woodshed. She wrapped herself in every piece of outdoor clothing she owned, tied a rope around her waist with the other end secured to the door handle, and pushed the door open against the wind's resistance. The cold hit her like a physical wall, sucking the air from her lungs. She couldn't see anything beyond 2 feet. Snow drove horizontally with such force it felt like sand blasting her exposed skin. She took 3 steps toward where the woodshed should be and encountered a wall of snow taller than her head. The drift was solid, packed by wind into a consistency like packed earth. She tried to dig with her hands, but the cold penetrated her mittens within seconds, turning her fingers numb and useless. The wind threatened to knock her off her feet. After less than 2 minutes outside, she followed the rope back to the cabin door and stumbled inside, gasping and shaking. Her face felt burned. Ice had formed in her eyebrows and hair. Emma started crying. Liv stared with wide, frightened eyes. That night, as the wind continued its relentless howl and the cabin temperature dropped to 20 degrees, Ingrid made her decision. She went to the corner where she had stored the metal firebox and the crocks of fuel mixture. Emma watched her mother drag the equipment to the center of the room and asked in a small voice, "What's that?" Ingrid answered quietly, "Something I made to keep you alive." Ingrid positioned the metal firebox in the center of the main room, away from walls and furniture, on a cleared section of the wooden floor. She had tested the device in the shed, but never under survival conditions, never with her daughters' lives depending on its function. Her hands shook as she arranged the components, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't determine. She placed a wooden crate on the floor and set one of the large fuel crocks on top, creating a platform approximately 2 feet high. The elevation was critical. Gravity would pull the fuel mixture through the copper tube that connected the crock to the firebox below. She carefully inserted one end of the tube into the fuel crock, making sure it reached near the bottom where the liquid sat. The other end she threaded through the hole in the firebox's side, positioning it above the tin tray that held the cotton wick material. She had prepared the wick bed that morning, layering cotton strips in the shallow tin tray until they formed a dense, absorbent mat. Now she opened the small valve on the copper tube and watched as her fuel mixture, 3 parts lard, 2 parts lamp oil, 1 part alcohol, began dripping slowly onto the cotton. The liquid was thick but pourable, moving through the tube with steady persistence. She let it drip for 30 seconds, saturating the wick bed, then closed the valve partially to slow the flow to 1 drop every 3 seconds. She struck a match and held it to the edge of the wick. The fuel caught immediately with a soft whoosh that made Emma gasp. The flame spread across the wick bed in a controlled burn, settling into a steady fire that filled the metal box with light. The flames burned with a distinctive color combination she had perfected during testing. Blue at the base where the alcohol burned hottest, orange and yellow higher up where the oils combusted. It was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected, almost mesmerizing. Heat began radiating from the firebox within minutes. She held her hand 12 inches above the metal grate and felt genuine warmth, more concentrated than the failing wood stove had produced in hours. The metal box itself began to glow faintly as it heated, becoming a radiant heat source that pushed warmth outward in an expanding circle. Ingrid gathered every blanket, fur, and piece of thick fabric in the cabin and created a nest on the floor around the firebox. She arranged them in layers, fur against the cold wooden floor, wool blankets on top, creating an insulated zone approximately 6 feet in diameter with the firebox at its center. She brought Emma and Liv to the nest and wrapped them in additional layers, their small bodies positioned close enough to the firebox to benefit from its heat, but far enough to prevent accidental burns. Liv reached out toward the flames, and Ingrid gently pulled her hand back. "It's hot, sweetheart. We look but don't touch." The girls huddled together, watching the strange metal box with its bright, steady fire. Outside, the wind continued screaming. Inside, they had a chance. The blizzard continued for 3 more days without pause. Ingrid kept vigil over the firebox with the intensity of a mother watching a sick child, adjusting the copper tube valve every few hours to maintain the precise drip rate that kept them alive. Too much fuel, and the flame burned too hot, wasting their limited supply and creating dangerous heat that could ignite the wooden floor. Too little, and the flame guttered and weakened, allowing cold to creep back into their survival zone. She learned to read the flame's behavior like a language, understanding when it needed more fuel by the way the blue base retreated or the orange peaks flickered. She calculated obsessively, scratching numbers into the wooden floor with a nail when she couldn't sleep. 40 gallons of fuel mixture total, current consumption rate, approximately half a gallon per day at minimal burn. That meant 80 days of fuel if the storm lasted. 80 days. The number both comforted and terrified her. They could survive almost 3 months if necessary, but the thought of 3 months in this frozen cabin made her want to scream. The cabin deteriorated around them as the storm raged. Snow found every gap in the chinking, every crack around the window frame, every imperfection in Lars's construction. It crept across the floor in white fingers, accumulating in corners and along the base of walls. Ingrid swept it out repeatedly, but it always returned. The frost on the interior walls thickened to quarter-inch ice in places, creating bizarre crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The wood stove sat cold and dark, its useless chimney clogged with ice. On the 3rd night, Emma developed a cough that made Ingrid's chest tighten with fear. It started as occasional throat clearing, but progressed to wet, rattling coughs that shook the girl's thin frame. Ingrid knew that sound. It was how Lars's pneumonia had begun. She forced Emma to drink melted snow heated carefully over the firebox flame, adding a spoonful of honey from their dwindling stores. She wrapped Emma in an additional layer of fur and held her close, feeling the child's body shiver despite the warmth. Liv became dangerously quiet, retreating into herself in a way that frightened Ingrid more than Emma's cough. The younger girl stopped asking questions, stopped playing with her corn husk doll, just stared at the firebox flames with glassy eyes. Ingrid recognized the signs of severe cold exposure, the lethargy, the withdrawal, the pale skin. She forced Liv to eat small pieces of dried venison, chewing it thoroughly before swallowing. She made Liv move her arms and legs every hour to maintain circulation. At night, Ingrid lay between her daughters, one arm around each, listening to the wind, and watching the firebox flame dance behind its metal grate. She told them stories about Norway, about summers so warm you could swim in the fjords, about her grandmother's farm where flowers grew tall as a child's waist. She promised them warmth would return. On January 14th, the wind finally began to weaken. The silence woke Ingrid on the morning of January 15th. After 5 days of relentless wind roar, the absence of sound felt unnatural, almost threatening. She extracted herself carefully from between her sleeping daughters and moved to the window. Outside, the world had been transformed into something alien and terrible. Snowdrifts reached the cabin's eaves in places, creating frozen waves that had crested and solidified mid-motion. The woodshed was completely buried, visible only as a vague rectangular depression in the white landscape. Temperature was still 30 below zero, but without wind, it felt almost survivable. She kept the firebox burning while she assessed their situation. The fuel crock was half empty. She had consumed approximately 2 gallons during the 5-day storm, less than her estimates predicted. The more controlled burn rate she had maintained during the worst nights had conserved fuel effectively. She calculated they had enough remaining for 60 more days if needed, though she prayed it wouldn't be. Over the next 2 days, as the temperature slowly rose and the sky cleared to a hard, brilliant blue, Ingrid began digging out the cabin. She used a wooden shovel to clear the door area, working in 20-minute shifts before retreating inside to warm herself by the firebox. The snow was packed solid by wind, dense as wet sand. Each shovelful felt like lifting stone. Her back and shoulders screamed with pain. By January 17th, she had cleared a narrow path to where the woodshed should be and began the slow process of excavating its buried door. Hans Bergman arrived that afternoon on snowshoes, a tall Norwegian bachelor who trapped 40 miles to the south. He was checking on isolated families, following a route that would take him to every cabin within a 2-day radius. His face was grim when Ingrid opened the door. "Have you seen the Schneiders?" he asked without preamble. Ingrid shook her head. Hans looked at the ground. "They're dead. All 5 of them. Friedrich, Katrina, the 3 children. I found them yesterday." The words hit Ingrid like a physical blow. She had last seen them in mid-December, Friedrich mocking her shed experiments, Katrina's pitying looks. Now they were gone. Hans explained what he had found. The Schneiders' wood supply had run out on the 2nd day of the blizzard. They had burned furniture, then floorboards, trying to stay warm. When that wasn't enough, they had huddled together under every blanket they owned. Hans found them frozen in a group, the children wrapped in their parents' arms. 2 other families had also perished. The Kowalskis, 4 miles east. The McGregors, 6 miles north. Hans had found 7 frozen bodies in 2 days of checking homesteads. He looked at Ingrid's cabin, at the frost-covered interior walls visible through the open door, at the snow still piled on the floor in corners. "How did you survive?" he asked quietly. Ingrid stepped aside and gestured toward the firebox, still burning steadily with its controlled flame. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you." Hans Bergman stood in the frost-covered cabin staring at the metal firebox as if it were a religious artifact. He walked around it slowly, examining the copper tube connection, the fuel crock positioned on the wooden crate, the steady flame burning behind the metal grate. He knelt and held his hands above the heat, feeling the concentrated warmth radiating upward. "This kept you alive?" he asked. Ingrid nodded. "For 5 days, through the worst of it." Hans looked at the crocks lined against the wall, at the primitive but functional fuel delivery system, at the children watching him quietly from their nest of blankets. "You need to teach people how to build this," he said. Word spread through the scattered frontier community with the speed that only survival information travels. Within 2 weeks, 7 families had visited Ingrid's cabin to see the firebox and learn its construction. She taught them everything freely, holding back nothing. She showed them how to modify metal containers, explaining the importance of ventilation holes and heat radiation. She shared her fuel mixture formula, writing it out carefully. 3 parts rendered lard, 2 parts lamp oil, 1 part grain alcohol. She demonstrated the copper tube valve system and how to calculate drip rates for different burn intensities. Some visitors were skeptical. A trapper named Morrison said it seemed complicated compared to just stacking more firewood. Ingrid didn't argue. She simply asked if he had enough wood stored to last through a month-long blizzard if his woodshed got buried. Morrison left quietly and returned 3 weeks later asking for detailed instructions. Others recognized the innovation's value immediately. A widow named Sarah Chen, who lived alone 12 miles west, built her version within days using a salvaged metal toolbox and copper tubing from an abandoned mining claim. By the following winter of 1884, 17 families in the region had built emergency heating systems based on Ingrid's design. They called them different names: firebox heaters, grease burners, storm boxes. But among themselves, particularly the Norwegian and Swedish families, they referred to them as Halvorsen fires. The name spread through immigrant communities across Dakota Territory and into Montana and Minnesota. Trading posts began stocking heavy-gauge metal boxes suitable for conversion. Blacksmiths learned to fabricate the fireboxes more efficiently, adding improvements like adjustable fuel valves and reinforced grate systems. The technique saved lives during subsequent harsh winters, though none matched the severity of 1883. In the winter of 1885, the Peterson family survived a 12-day cold snap when their chimney collapsed under ice weight. Their firebox kept them alive until neighbors could reach them. In 1886, a late spring blizzard caught the Johansen family unprepared with depleted wood supplies. Their emergency heating system sustained them through 4 critical days. Across the northern frontier, families who had adopted the innovation survived situations that would have killed them using traditional methods alone. Ingrid never profited from her invention. She continued living in her cabin with Emma and Liv, trapping small game and farming a modest vegetable plot through short Dakota summers. Emma later wrote in a memoir published in 1922 that her mother kept the original firebox until she died in 1904 at age 53. It sat in the cabin corner, dented and stained, a reminder of the week they survived when others froze.